Delighted to see everyone here. Welcome to all of you who are physically with us, and also to all of those of you watching on Facebook Live. We here in Cambridge are delighted to assist in the temporary escape from New Haven for Dr. Salima Ikram, who's currently serving out her sentence, who is teaching as visiting professor at Yale University. She's also Distinguished Professor of Egyptology at the American University in Cairo and Extraordinary Professor at Stellenbosch University. And she's worked in Egypt since 1986. After double majoring in history, as well as classical and Near Eastern archaeology at Bryn Mawr College, she received her MPhil degree in museology and Egyptian archaeology, and then her PhD in Egyptian archaeology from Cambridge University. She's directed the Animal Mummy Project, co-directed the Predynastic Gallery Project and the North Karga Oasis Survey, and is director of the North Karga Oasis Darb Ain Amor Survey and the Amen Messa mission of tombs KV10 and KV63 in the Valley of the Kings. But you might know her best from the many appearances she's made on television documentaries, where her scholarly expertise and wonderful on-camera presence have enhanced many a scene. Dr. Ikram has written several books for adults and for children and published a wide variety of scholarly articles with topics ranging from mummification to the eating habits of the ancient Egyptians. And just this week, I'm delighted to report she was inducted into the American Academy of Arts and Sciences located right here in Cambridge. Tonight, she will share some of the secrets she's unlocked concerning divine creatures, animal mummies in ancient Egypt. Dr. Salima Ikram.
Thank you, Peter, for that lovely introduction, and to you, too. It's a great honor and a pleasure. Tell me if it gets echoey. It's a great honor and a pleasure to be here. I'm moving away from that microphone. Because I spent the first 4 years of my life in Cambridge, Massachusetts, and spent a lot of it in the Archaeology Museum, the Peabody, and with the glass flowers, and doing probably unspeakable things in the dugout canoes because we were allowed to at that time. And also it's very nice to be here with Peter, who, when I was a baby Egyptologist, was most helpful and supportive when I was doing my PhD and did not laugh at my topic on meat mummification. So you can see where it takes you. Anyway, everyone knows that the ancient Egyptians mummified humans. But not as many people know that they also mummified animals. Now, the mummy is an artificially preserved body of a human or an animal, and so artificial is key. So all those people who pretend that bog bodies and freeze-dried people are mummies, barking up the wrong tree. So the word mumia comes from this black goo. And I use that word advisedly, it's a technical term. So if you have not tested this black material, which in the ancient world they thought was bitumen, or not in the ancient world, but historically people thought that this was bitumen. And the word for that in Arabic was mum, or mumia. And the idea was that these things that were made with mumia were made with bitumen and were very precious and important to the Arab doctors and later the Western physicians. But that's what gave this the name. So it comes from the term bitumen and from a mistaken idea that these creatures over there and people were preserved using this material. Now, animals were very, very important to the ancient Egyptians for a variety of things. Obviously, we know from the basic thing, their food, clothing, raw materials come from the animal world. But also for the ancient Egyptians, their language, some of the sounds, because they loved onomatopoeia, as well as the letters themselves are derived from animals. We also have gods who are animal-derived, and in fact, each god had an animal totem. So you can see that these creatures had a major, major role in the lives of the ancient Egyptians. Now, here we can see we have a couple of animal mummies to lead you in gently. We have a huge variety of animals that were mummified from ancient Egypt. So you can see that they include mammals, reptiles, birds, insects down here, little scarab beetles, and also here we actually have eggs. So really it is quite a panoply. However, one might think that creatures such as these were very important and were well regarded historically once people started to dig them up. But that was not the case, either for humans or for animals. So a lot of mummies have been used as fuel. They have been ground up because they thought that they were made of bitumen and eaten as medicine. Exactly. At one point, Augustus Stanhope of Maine, during the American Civil War, wanted to make brown paper to wrap up the Sunday roast in. And, of course, there was a cotton crisis on. So he thought, I've been to Egypt, I know what they have a lot of. So he gathered the mummies, took the wrappings, chucked the mummies, used the wrappings, and mushed them up and turned them into brown paper and used them to wrap the Sunday roast, till someone found out. Cat mummies in particular suffered hideous deaths, as it were. After being revered by the ancient Egyptians and mummified, they wind up being used as fertilizer because they were taken as ballast for ships. And so they were put into holds of boats so they wouldn't come back from Egypt going bob, 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 bob. And when they got to Marseille or Liverpool or wherever, in the beginning they would just be thrown overboard. But after a while they thought, well, that's a waste, so let's sell them as fertilizer. So we have the nice Punch cartoon showing you mummies being ground up and used as fertilizer. And whether this is an apocryphal tale or not, someone has said that because they were in the ship's hold when there was a lot of water that had bacteria of different varieties, people started to get sick. And so they put it down to the mummies and stopped importing them in quite that way, or at least stopped using them in that way. Now, we have many different types of animal mummies, and I will go through those as we progress. There are pets, which you all understand, because many people here... How many people here have pets? How many people here have cats? Peter? Okay. Well, the ancient Egyptians were big on pets, and we will talk about them. And of course, you understand the desire to take your beloved pet with you. Food mummies are a very particular ancient Egyptian type. Sacred animals which won them the criticism of the Romans. Votive offerings, which is what you will see both in the Peabody and the Semitic Museum. And of course, because we are archaeologists and sometimes we have to admit that we don't know things, that we can't make them up enough, and ritual purposes won't suffice. So that is when we say other. So why do we study animal mummies? Now we study them because, instead of throwing them away, because we actually realize that there is a lot that can be derived from them. We can learn about ancient climate and environment, different species and their evolution. Recently there has been an increase in DNA work to try and establish this. Veterinary practices of the ancient Egyptians, obviously their religious and cultural beliefs, technology of mummification, trade. What kind of materials are being used to make these mummies? Do they all come from Egypt? And even within Egypt, what is a trade network? Which of course leads to economy. And also sometimes the animals themselves. Exotic pet import and export actually probably started in ancient Egypt. By looking at animal mummies, we can see if there is diachronic change by looking at the wrappings, or is it fashion, or is it geography, or is it the particular hand of one great artiste who says, I will embalm and wrap thus. But it is a question that we have because we have so many different styles. And most of the animal mummies we have were unfortunately taken and not excavated in a proper stratigraphic way. So this is why we have so many more questions about these particular group of artifacts than we would about others. Now, how do we study animal mummies? Pretty much in the same way we do humans. To look at them and to learn how they were made and to extract as much data out of them as is possible, we use the mummies themselves. And obviously the first thing to do is carry out a visual analysis. Then we do radiographs, CT scans, if you have the money, and you can also test the embalming materials, which gives us a great insight into how they were made and also where the materials came from. So X-rays are sometimes, if it's in a museum, it's much nicer and easier. But most often, we are in the field balancing our X-ray machine on one place or the other. Sometimes we can do museum CT scans. This is at the Smithsonian, where this baboon is going in to be checked out. And these give us extraordinary results because in the old days, in the 19th century and even the start of the 20th century, what people were doing was unwrapping, which I will be shot down by museum curators for saying this, but it does actually have a place in the field when you have a damaged object and there is no hope of recuperation, because you get some information out of it which allows you to much better interpret your images. Of course, by now, the imaging is so sophisticated that it's not necessarily the case. But in the early days, having unwrapped bits of mummies that were, a bit of a leg or a bit of an arm or half an ibis, it taught you a lot, so that when you looked at these radiographs or the CT scans, you could say, oh, I know what's going on. No, what you're saying is completely wrong because I've seen it. If you twist it this way, you will see that this is really a handful of straw stuffed into the mummy rather than some dread disease that it has. So, as you can see, this is sort of, by doing these CTs, you can basically undress and then dress an entire cat going from skeleton outward, which is, of course, an invaluable way of studying these creatures and gives us enormous insights into all of the questions I have mentioned. Now, how are mummies made? Of course, it's going to depend slightly on whether they are fish, whether they have fins or feathers or furs or scales, because that does make a difference as to what's inside, how long it would take. Because mummification is, in essence, a desiccation process. So the first thing that happens is they are eviscerated. Depending on, if you're a human, you get a nice little cute cut here. But if you are an animal, you get a bigger cut up your ventral side and all your entrails are removed. Now, humans tend to be excerebrated, their brains are taken out. But most of our animals do not need that because they're not that big, and also brains, when they putrefy, are not as explosively awful as one's viscera. So most of the animals have those left in. The next thing is desiccation with natron. Natron is a naturally occurring salt, sort of a combination of salt and baking soda that occurs in the Wadi Natron, which is in the sort of little bit west of Cairo and slightly to the north. After one has eviscerated and desiccated, for humans the sort of canonical days are 40 days, but obviously it depends. If you've got a small mouse, you're not going to spend 40 days drying it. You can spend 5 days doing it, and it'll be quite nice, thank you very much. So that varies. We also then, after it's been dried, what happens is that we have to anoint it with oils and resins. And although there are no ancient Egyptian texts that tell you how to mummify, there are some things that talk about what happens after it's dried. The last 30 days of wrapping and chanting of spells and putting in of amulets and applying oils and unguents. So why, after you dry something, would you rehydrate, in essence, by using oils and unguents? And it's because you're too stiff. If you start wrapping something like that, bits fall off and break off, and then you're stuffed, really. So a lot of the sacred oils are to give them a little bit more flexibility so that when you actually wrap, you will find out that it's quite necessary. And also, this I've learnt through experimental work, which I'll talk about in a minute, But also the resins are generally yellowy, gold. And they give, when you pour it over the body, they impart a golden hue. What happens once you're dead and when you are being transformed into a mummy, which is a divine being that lives eternally, is you're going from being a human to a god. The flesh of the gods is made of gold, their hair is of lapis lazuli, and their bones are of silver. This seems to be the same for an animal. Because this is why you will see that sometimes you get these cats with their gilded faces, because it's showing that they have moved from being mere cat into divine cat. And after they've been oiled and resined and people are chanting prayers, so they're building a metaphorical as well as a physical defense around the body of the animal. They are then, amulets are put in, and so then they're consecrated, and then they can be buried. Same as with humans. But of course, we get variations with animals. By looking at embalming places, we learn more about how things were made. This is for the Apis bull, a great bull, and these are probably for the internal organs that were embalmed separately. For the application of goo, the black material that until you've done your gas chromatography, mass spectrometry, we will call goo because we don't know what it is. But this is the application place in the site of Tuna El Gebel. Now, sometimes we know that some of the animals weren't eviscerated at all. A lot of the birds seem to have just been dried in natron and then dipped in a vat of boiling, well, maybe not boiling because someone had to hold them in, oil and resins. Now, experimental work has proven to be very, very useful in elucidating how mummies were made. Please remember these were all bought from the butcher, so they were destined for the pot. But now, because they were mummified, they will live forever like any good Egyptian. So Flopsy was our control bunny, and we didn't do any evisceration or anything, and she just exploded, and then because her viscera putrefied. Whereas Mopsy, you can see, was eviscerated and nicely dried out. We were very anxious because this was the first desiccation. Thumper, we made him a nice little small cut and removed the internal organs and put in very cute natron bags. Never put natron in state because what it does is it goes and it sucks out all the wet, anything liquid in your body. But of course, if you've got a small cut and you want to remove it, it's very difficult and gooey, especially if you're trying to use ancient Egyptian tools. So this is why the ancient Egyptians, we discovered, used these neat little baggies so that you can put them in and pull them out and change them around, and there is no reason for any of your embalmers to stand at the edge of the biology building throwing up. After desiccation, we could see this is when we learned why you had to put lots of oil on, but a right amount so that it doesn't overhydrate. And it also teaches us that when you've got larger mammals, you really need to have teams of people manipulating these things. And I mean, the idea of eviscerating an Apis bull, you have to take out these stomachs, and you need a lot of upper body strength and a couple of people doing it because the bull probably ate before it died. So that's another interesting insight. Once everything is done, we have given them full final rites, and you can visit these and make offerings. They like to have gin, chocolate, and carrot in that order. So now let me show you some of the animal mummies and what you can learn from them. So pet mummies are self-explanatory. We all want our pets to be with us in the afterlife to frolic fulsomely, whether it is a cat or a monkey. Here we have Happy Min, who is currently visitable in the University of Pennsylvania Museum. He was dug up by Petrie and Abydos, and he was found in his coffin with a little bundle that you cannot really see very well, sorry, on the side, which actually was at his feet. And this turned out, when they examined it, to be his pet dog. So the dog probably would have slept at his feet, like you see with the knights. So the dog was there, and probably pined after Hapi Min, and was then hastily mummified and buried at Hapi Min's feet so they could be together for eternity. Now, this is a coffin from Asyut, and here we have a man and his dog. Please note the back scratcher was invented in ancient Egypt. And they're both named quite happily. Now, unfortunately, the coffin was robbed, so we don't know if he was at his feet, but I like to think that they were both buried together so they could hang out in the afterlife. Even horses, once they were introduced to Egypt, have been buried with great panoply. Here we have there's a bit of the horse, and there is his coffin. And these are two of my favorites. They were found in the Valley of the Kings, like this, but probably thieves put them in this position so that the dog, they'd rifle through the tomb. And there are several tombs of animals in the Valley of the Kings. And this might have been a hunting dog for King Amenhotep II or King Horemheb, and this might have been a pet monkey. But the monkey is looking depressed, and the dog saying, "Cheer up, old chap, it can't be that bad in the afterlife." Here we have a story of great tragedy, drama, and reputations that have been besmirched. Here is Ma Kare. She was found in the late 19th century. She was a high priestess. She was supposed to be, according to the excavators of the time, a virgin priestess, though I'm not quite sure where they got that idea. But, oh my God, she was buried with a baby. So speculation was rife. Publications went left, right, and center. She had, died in childbirth. She was killed because she had an illegitimate child. This, that, and the other. So for about a century, her reputation was in tatters until the 1960s, when there was a project to X-ray the royal mummies in the Cairo Museum. And in July, late in the day, the team finally said, we're done, but we have one last cartridge of film. And Nasri said, well, we should do something with it. And they're like, well, we've done everything. He said, no, let's do the baby. That's a vervet monkey. So she had her pet monkey buried with her, and for a long time, they all said really nasty things, which tells you where their minds were. Anyway, we have other monkey pets and some baboons, which you can see over here. Now, the second kind of mummies we have are food mummies, victual mummies, because the Egyptians believed you can take it with you. And let us not be hungry in the afterlife. The afterlife must be a great time where you're going to eat and drink and be merry. So, let's snack. Tutankhamun had over 40 boxes of food, and we must remember he was a growing boy. He was an 18 or 19-year-old. We have, and these mummies, unlike pet mummies, which are, pets complete, they are prepared as if you would go to Shop and Stop, ready to go. You can buy your roast. We have no chickens in ancient Egypt, but goose or duck, with the heads cut off, eviscerated, wingtips, feet, all cut off, mummified, perhaps even cooked, smeared with resins, and then nowadays they don't do this in these stores, I've discovered. They don't give you the giblets back to make your gravy, but the ancient Egyptians were not cheapskates, so you have your giblets inside, reintroduced into the body for your gravy, and then you put into a nice little coffinette and sent off. Here you can see some of the giblets. Barbecued ribs, invented in ancient Egypt. Interestingly, doing some of these tests, we have found that these were nicely scanning electron microscopy as well as testing for the resins, that sometimes quite expensive terebinth resin imported from what is now Lebanon was used to make these. But it's also interesting, it's a high status thing, you get it in human mummies as well, but you also use it for cooking. So sometimes you use these incenses as flavor. So was this because it was just the incense also deodorizes and disinfects and inhibits bacteria, that it also might be part of an ancient Egyptian recipe? Now, Sacred animals are the ones that are the most curious type. We have, from Alexandria to Aswan, we have cemeteries from about 700 BC to 200 AD in particular, filled with animals, with one of them being sort of the sacred animal and the other ones being votive. Now, the sacred animal is the idea because all gods had an animal that was associated with him or her. So the goddess Sekhmet, in charge of plagues, had the lioness. God Horus we have with his, actually it's a super hawk. It's a super raptor made up of lots of different ones. But the idea was that a living animal, recognizable by certain markings, was there on earth, and the spirit of the god entered into the body of that animal. During that animal's lifetime, he would live as a god, be prayed to, give oracles, do all kinds of things. And then, upon his death, the spirit of the god would enter and migrate into the body of a similarly marked animal, which the priests would recognize, and the original god would be mummified with great pomp and circumstance, and then be buried in an elaborate tomb and catacomb in one of these places in the temple. It's basically the same idea of the Dalai Lama, the migrating soul, invented in ancient Egypt. Just saying. Some of the most common things are bull cults, and those are the ones that are most famous. We have major ones starting from the first dynasty, about 3000 BC, up in the area of Saqqara, and continuing on into the 5th century AD. This is the Serapeum at Saqqara, which gives you a sense of these vast catacombs, which contained also votive stelae, but also massive sarcophagi that were supposed to contain the bodies of the sacred bulls, except only one was found with anything resembling a bull burial. However, at the Smithsonian Museum in Washington, D.C., you can actually see one of 2 complete bull mummies, and really these are the only 2 in the world, coming from Saqqara, purchased by Henry Abbott in the 19th century. So we tried to x-ray it. You can see that success level was kind of low, but they're very quite beautiful things. Now we have another kind of mummy in another place, is Bucus bull, and where not just the bull, but the bull's family was also revered. So the mother of Bucus, you can see looking a little bit messed up, but originally would have looked, and this is after unwrapping a bit, they would have probably, the excavators reconstructed them as looking like this. Oh, here, looking rather grand. So they were wondering, because they seemed to be a little in a collapsed state, and also what was queer about this particular site was they found a lot of these things that looked like oil cans. The excavators, Mond and Myers, thought, okay, nice, you know, whatever. Took some of the bulls, took some of the bits and pieces, took some of the bead nets adorning the mummies, and took a number of the oil cans, inexplicable oil cans, back to England and put them on display. Now, one of them had a friend who was a veterinarian, and the vet came and said, oh, I know what that is. It's an enema. I use it for large mammals. Now, our friend Herodotus, who lived in the 5th century BC, actually records different types of mummification, and he had said the ancient Egyptians used enemas of cedar oil. And a lot of people had said, oh, pish. People say pish a lot to Herodotus, and I think they're all wrong, because he was probably more right than wrong. So basically, then after this came to light, everyone said, well, they must have done this, and there was more speculation, and this was done in the late 30s. So until about there was speculation continuing until the 2000 or 1998, when we decided to try making a cedar oil enema and using it on a Peter Cottontail. So we gave him, we have found some places that there seem to be some princess of the Middle Kingdom, and also some late period mummies and Greco-Roman mummies that seem to have been made this way. So we put, using a pipette, obviously not this, for the mummy, and all you do is you pour it in, using an enema, plug it up, put it in Natron, and leave it. It's really one of the least messy things, except right at the end where you have to unplug the edge, and then you press down, but do not stand behind because everything squirts out, and is a bit stinky. As one of my 8-year-old friends said, "Ooh, that's germ warfare." So the heart, interestingly, is always left in the body, but during this process it gets dislodged and moves around, but it is one of the strongest muscles, so everything else melts and the heart remains. So this proved that this was an effective way of creating a mummy. Now we have sacred animals. It's harder to identify them because a lot of them might have been robbed in antiquity, but we have a few. This is a ram sacred to the god Khnum, found at Elephantine. And what is interesting is that you can see very, very old, teeth are all worn down, quite nice, there are lots of amulets in. But what some of these showed, we've x-rayed about 10 of them, that is all that survive, it's another story, but some of them don't have horns. We can't tell, with a few, the horns have actually been cut off and maybe were used to make the headdresses of priests as well as royalty. But some of them don't seem to have horns at all. Were they sheep? I don't like that idea. Yeah, but they could have been sheep, and maybe this is actually a family, again, like you get the mothers of Apis and the mothers of so-and-so. We have had some wonderful crocodiles, which are quite large, over 18 feet. And this one, when I was cleaning, I thought, what is wrong with you? Why have we not cleaned this properly? There's all this stuff in your mouth, they're sticks. And I pulled them out, and they were baby crocs. Because crocodiles often, to keep their babies safe, initially open their mouth and all the babies come in obediently and they take them safely to the water, then they swim around and are transported back. And then when they get a bit bigger, they do everything on mama's back. So we have a few of those as well, which is quite interesting, especially since they're all supposed to be male crocodiles. Right now, I'm trying to do something at the Peabody in Yale, where we have a crocodile with babies to see if we can genetically find any linkage between them. Now, the largest number of animal mummies that we have are votive offerings. And these are basically like lighting a candle in a church, except a candle, you light it, it's gone. The Egyptians were long-term, none of this momentary rubbish. So what they did was that they took, sometimes they would give a stele, sometimes they would give a statue as an offering. But they thought that an actual live animal who was of the same image as the god, and if you give it as a sacrifice, blood sacrifice, then it is worth much more and carries more weight with the god. So if you want to get something out of the deity, you give this kind of offering. And from about 600 BC to 300 AD-ish, we have a huge concentration of this type of animal mummy, where they were being purchased by pilgrims, dedicated at a temple, and then being consecrated for a while, kept in a room, and at festivals that happened twice or thrice a year, they were taken from this temple room and interred in large, complex catacombs, which were then sealed up until the next event. All kinds of animals were mummified during this time, whether they were scarab beetles, whether they were ibises, catfish, kestrels, crocodiles, dogs, cats, sheep, you name it. Now, there are several in this room here in Cairo, and there are collections in Lyon, as well as in a couple of other places. One of the largest sites for the sacred animal necropoli is in Saqqara. It's very much like what you would see, if you go to Fatima in Portugal or Lourdes or places like that, because even now, pilgrims are buying votive offerings and giving them. So this is something that is very much part of human desire and wish fulfillment. It goes back to 3000 BC. It shows you we haven't changed one whit. I like this one very much because this is a human-sized ibis, which is filled with lots of ibis mummies. Unfortunately, it doesn't have a provenance. The ibises, here we go. At the site of Abydos, we have a huge number of these. This is a construction that dates to about 2900 BC, loosely, whatever. But later on, a sand dune filled it up, and in about 600 BC, people started to use the sand dune to stuff in ibis pots. So it's chock-a-block with ibises. Here you go. Here you can see some peeking out, falling out, but not just ibises. We have dogs as well, which I was delighted by. So you pull out, there's a bit of mud, there's a bit of stuff, and this is handsome Herman, who is most delightful because his beak was filled with shells, so that he could eat these shells in the afterlife. Now, these ibises are associated with the god Thoth, partially because their beak represents a pen, and they also walk around like that, searching in the mud, like Thoth searching for wisdom. But also, they eat snails, and some of the snails that they eat carry bilharzia, or schistosomiasis. Did the ancient Egyptians know that these animals were actually helping kill the carrier of schistosomiasis, and is that why they were extra happy? Because Thoth was also associated with being the god of medicine. We don't know, but it's a nice something to play with. Here's handsome Herman, and you can see some of the shells in his beak. Subsequently, we found some other shell ibises that we have x-rayed, and they have also been fed, as it were. Another group is working on the DNA of ibises that have been mummified to see were they being specially bred, and so you will get the same sort of DNA repeating from a population, or were they wild captures, and then you will get a greater diversity. Cats, very popular. Now, you would think that, it's going to the gods. It didn't always die naturally. Some of them were killed. Cats have been strangled, some of them have had their heads put in, some of the puppies were taken away from their mother very early, they might have been drowned, they might have not been fed, because we've got all ages and ranges for these animals. This break over here is a later break, but you can see that they did try and personify, as it were, their animals and give them the same kind of burial equipment that a human being would have, down to masks and coffins. In fact, cats have been used recently, well, actually quite earlier, by Leslie Lyons to look at cat domestication, which previously was thought to be coming from Cyprus, and then they proved that it was not, it was coming from Egypt. And more recently, this year, there's been yet another study using cat mummies to do DNA that further reinforces the antiquity of the cat in Egypt. So you can see how these animals, mummies, are being used to really change the way we look at the natural world around us. Now, this one's lovely. You can see, beautiful little raptor, very fine head. But if you look at the x-ray, there's no head. Because sometimes bits are missing, and sometimes you only get bits, because maybe the part symbolizes a whole. And if you didn't at a particular time have a lot of the whole, you split up a part. Or, of course, maybe goes back to the archive of Hor when people were being cheated. This is a very nice kestrel we had in South Africa. Coming from Egypt, of course, but in the South African collection. And we pared it down, and we found, oh my gosh, there's a bunch of stuff in its stomach, so it wasn't properly eviscerated, but we found eviscerated cuts. But there's a tail of a mouse, so it choked. So generally these birds go and they get rid of their little balls of whatever, but this one was not allowed to because it had old food in its belly. So either it was sick or it had been force-fed and it had no choice, and then it just went, wah! And you can see that we've got, bits of probably a sparrow, bits of mice, lots of bits of mice, and fur as well. Sometimes things are not so neatly buried. You get this mound, and you can see here, there's a bit of a, they're interspersed here are birds as well as shrews. The shrew is this is this big, in its Sunday best here, nocturnal version of the sun god, he who can see well at night. Often you find them with raptors, diurnal version of the sun god. This is a bundle of shrews. I got up to 21 and then lost count. Neil Woodman from the Smithsonian is working. We're working together to try and do more shrew identification because there are one or two species that are extinct, but we want to track down and see, were they here in ancient times, or when did they sort of stop being in Egypt? These are very nice shrews from these ones are from Abydos, and here they're reflecting their solar nature by being gilded. Recently, we've been looking at the Tomb of the Dogs, or the dog catacomb in Saqqara, where we have estimated, unfortunately, yes, we are standing on dogs. But there is no other way because they're piled a meter 80 or 70 high, and a lot of them have, because of the humidity, just the bandages have turned to powder. And we have done sampling, and we estimated that this catacomb, when full, contained 8 million dogs. Million. 8 million. So there was a huge industry. Now, this has been very helpful for veterinary practices, sometimes the absence thereof. And I will go back to that in a minute. Sometimes you think, oh, very definite, tail here, head here. X-ray, sorry, it's not showing up so well here, but shows, head where the tail should be, and there's another head as well. So people weren't paying much attention and sometimes put two things together. This one, with a very nice image of an ibis on the outside, inside contains sand and a couple of feathers. The other thing is also, of course, when you're making a god, if any bits fall off, they're sacred, so you can't toss them in the bin. So you must wrap them up and give them as an offering. Here's another beautifully wrapped thing. Now remember what your mother might have told some of you? Never judge a book by its cover. Generally with an animal mummy, 90% of the time, the prettier it is outside, the more suspicious you should be inside. Though this one has a bit of an egg in there. But I mean, it is incredible how many mummies have been created. We have 8 million dogs. We have ibises in Saqqara that are less, but probably not that much less if we start calculating properly. Cats and bubastis, which I just made a stab at. So this was really big business. It wasn't, so you have people coming, you have cutting the catacombs, you need teams of workmen. Taking the dirt away, teams of workmen. Creating the pots, teams of workmen. Breeding the animals, priests, or maybe even cottage industries so that people have a better economic life and can be connected in with the temple and have a sense of attachment and loyalty to the temple. And especially in this later period, the kings weren't giving as much in terms of funding to religious institutions, so they were out on their own. So maybe this is part of their marketing strategy to try and get A, loyalty, and B, also make sure things were ticking over and in fact being quite good. You also have to get bandage, old bandages, linens, but going around houses and collecting them from people. And then the last bits are always nicely done. So you must have extra special people who are doing these patterns, and we've got some of our conservators practicing how to make these patterns, because you wrap up the mummy, doesn't look so good, put some string on to keep the bandages in place, but then you put a nicely constructed shroud and sew it in place so it looks very fancy. So you can see the materials that are used for mummification, the resins, all of these things are also not just representative of a huge religious system, but also are a part of an enormous economic construct that really played a major role in the Egyptian economy and life in the late period. So you can see, and also, of course, you have the pilgrims, where you're going to have inns for them. You're going to have drinking holes for them. You're going to sell them tchotchkes. They're probably going to go off and have a nice time with people of ill repute, and be of ill repute themselves. But again, the kind of industry that surrounds it is enormous. There you go. Think of those hotels that they were having in the ancient world. So any place that had an animal cult and could get a good festival going was guaranteed to make sure that they got some, funds for the temple, popularity, and had a place on the map. So really, by studying animal mummies, we are not just studying that one animal or that one mummy, but really this is a window into the whole of ancient Egyptian life, religion, and culture. Thank you very much.